Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Egypt's Mubarak declared clinically dead after a stroke. Sudanese student rise up against Bashir's austerity plan. And Bahrain's opposition escalates protests demanding the release of political prisoners. Mosaic World News from the Middle East begins now.
Egypt's deposed ruler Hosni Mubarak is clinically dead. We're hearing that he died following a stroke. Mubarak was moved to a military hospital after being put on a respirator. Security around Caira's central prison has been tightened. Mubarak was sentenced to a life term for his role in the killing of protesters during last year's revolution. He had suffered from high blood pressure and breathing difficulties in recent times.
Protesters in Egypt are planning another big push against their military rulers. The Muslim Brotherhood has called for large demonstrations across the country. Over the weekend, the Military Council dissolved Parliament and claimed all legislative powers. It's also taken control of the state budget and given itself veto power on a new constitution. The Muslim Brotherhood has called this a constitutional coup. At the same time, soldiers have blocked all roads to Parliament after word spread that MPs might attempt to enter the building.
This is not a question of breaking into the parliament building. As I said, we do not accept this ruling because it's void, and we will continue the struggle we began last year. We are saying that the entire revolution and all the gains we made through the revolution have just been destroyed with one blow.
Meanwhile, both candidates in the runoff presidential election are claiming victory. The Brotherhood says its candidate Mohammed Morsy has won 52% of the votes, 4 percentage points more than Ahmed Shafiq. But Shafiq's campaign says the claim is false. It says more than half of voters have chosen Mubarak's right-hand man as Egypt's next president. A tit-for-tat response. The Palestinian resistance group Hamas says it has fired 10 Grad rockets at Israel. This is in retaliation, it says, for Israeli raids that killed 6 Palestinians. Hamas calls the rocket attack an answer to Israel's crimes, adding it will continue firing rockets if Tel Aviv carries out more strikes on Gaza. Hamas also confirmed it is the first time it's fired such long-range rockets at Israel since April 2011. The retaliation came after Israeli warplanes pounded the coastal enclave for the second consecutive day. 2 Palestinians were killed, both of them teenagers. 4 other Palestinians also lost their lives in a double Israeli attack on Monday.
Palestinian terrorists are continuing to fire rockets into Israel this afternoon. In all, more than a dozen missiles have hit the Ashkelon region and the Eshkol Regional Council since last night. None have caused injuries or significant damage. But in a rare departure from the norm, the Hamas and its Izzadin al-Qassam military wing claimed responsibility for firing at least 3 of the mortars. Hamas said they were targeting the Ziki military base in response to the recent killing of 4 Palestinians by the IDF. During the past 24 hours, the Air Force has conducted a number of raids. One strike hit a terrorist cell. It was planting an explosive device near the border with central Gaza. 2 Islamic Shiite operatives were killed in that attack. IDF Chief of Staff General Benny Gantz today visited the site of yesterday's terrorist attack near the security fence on the Egyptian border, where an Israeli construction worker was murdered and 2 terrorists were killed by soldiers in the ensuing gunfight. Lieutenant General Gantz said that Israel expects Egypt to exercise its sovereignty. The Chief of Staff also noted that the construction of the security fence along the Egyptian border is continuing at a very brisk pace, but he cautioned that the bigger problem is what takes place inside Sinai, because terror bases are currently forming there. The U.S. has expressed concern about the unrest in Sinai and with the instability it is creating along the Egyptian-Israeli border.
The United States condemns today's attacks deadly attacks, terrorist attacks on civilians in Israel from the Sinai, and all acts of terrorism in the strongest terms. We extend our deepest condolences to the victims, their families, and loved ones. We remain concerned about the security situation in the Sinai Peninsula and call for restraint on all sides. More broadly, we encourage the Egyptian government to find a lasting resolution to the issue of Sinai security.
Do you think that the SCAF is not doing enough in the Sinai right now? Do you think what is this indicative of? Is it a complete loss of control?
We've had, incidents, as you know, throughout the past year, and the Egyptians and the Israelis have tried to work together after each of these incidents to learn lessons, to strengthen control. So, this is what we're calling for again, that they look into how this incident occurred and that more broadly there be lasting solutions that give everybody confidence along that border.
In Sudan, Khartoum University is witnessing a second day of demonstrations against Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir's decision to raise oil prices.
Al-Bashir had announced a package of political and economic measures, which include lifting oil subsidies, reducing a number of state ministries, and dismissing ministers in both central and provincial governments by up to 50%.
The Sudanese political scene is tense after the announcement of brutal economic measures with which the authorities are attempting to overcome the crisis the country is experiencing. These measures will aggravate the already difficult living conditions for the Sudanese people. In Parliament, the Sudanese president announced a series of reforms, most notably cuts in the number of federal government officials through the elimination of ministries and dismissal of ministers and provincial officials. However, al-Bashir vowed to support the poor.
The cuts will apply to government positions and officials in executive and legislative departments by around 45% and then 50%. But we vow to exert the greatest efforts to alleviate the impact of these measures on the poor and those with a limited income.
The Sudanese government's measures were confronted by strong criticism from the opposition. The opposition denounced the government for transferring the burden of the state's careless spending and its negative political repercussions on the citizens by lifting subsidies on basic products.
There is no planning. The Ministry of Finance doesn't have authority over public funds because certain institutions have complete control. There is mismanagement in all parts of the government. There is corruption. So within this regime, Sudan's issues cannot be solved, nor can stability be achieved. Wars will continue between the parties. The economic crisis will become even more complicated.
The new measures were confronted by demonstrations organized by a number of Khartoum University students protesting the government's economic policies and the price increases. The demonstrators were quickly dispersed by the police. President Bashir is expected to issue decisions on restructuring the government and reshuffling the cabinet following the implementation of the new economic policies. But the government has limited options to overcome the economic crisis. Meanwhile, the opposition has many options, which it says begin with confronting the regime. So the expectations for the situation in the coming phase are mixed. Al-Tahir Al-Mardi, Al Jazeera, Al-Khartoum.
In Bahrain, massive demonstrations broke out across the country. Regime forces launched a series of raids in a number of residential areas to arrest citizens. The towns were flooded in a barrage of poisonous gas.
This is how the Bahraini scene starts in broad daylight, and this is how Bahrainis spend their nights in many areas. Bahraini regime forces stormed the citizens' homes and carried out a series of raids in many areas, during which many people were arrested. Massive marches broke out in various regions across the country, such as Deraz, Sanabiz, Abu Saiba, Ali, Bani Jamra, Samahij, Bilad al-Khadim, Adair, and others, to condemn the regime's arbitrary practices. The regime's forces initiated a crackdown on peaceful marches across the country. The repressive measures included besieging certain areas and barring citizens from entering or exiting. The Bahraini authorities insist on continuing the repression campaign to resolve the political crisis that the country has been living under for over 16 months. It was not only the young men in the protests who were targeted, but it was also the women who ran out of their houses after the security forces fired poisonous and suffocating gas at them. The women were faced by regime forces who directly assaulted them with the use of shotguns at times and stun grenades and asphyxiating gas at others.
The Norwegian newspaper Oslo Times online version published a comprehensive report on the violent and criminal crackdown on the peaceful protests in Bahrain by the order of the king. The report called for an international mobilization to save the Bahraini people. The website said the authorities in Al-Manama committed the most egregious forms of human rights violations. It confirmed the facts released by international media networks supporting the Bahraini regime completely differ from the gloomy truth. The newspaper showed evidence proving the involvement of members of the ruling family in torturing detainees, the regime forces' practices of raping children and stabbing them with knives, as well as using birdshot pellets amid international silence.
In southeastern Turkey, at least 8 Turkish soldiers were killed and 16 others were wounded, and 10 were killed from the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. The attack was launched by members of the banned PKK on a Turkish military station in Hakkari province near the border with Iran and Iraq.
According to Turkish security and media sources, a number of Turkish soldiers were killed and 15 others injured, and 10 members of the banned Kurdistan Workers' Party were killed in an attack launched by PKK members in a remote area of southeastern Turkey. The attack took place in the Daluja area of Yoksakova city in the province of Hakkari, located by the border with Iraq and Iran. The rugged mountainous regions of southeastern Turkey often witness such attacks, and the Turkish Hakkari province is a region that often sees violent battles between Turkish security forces and members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. PKK members usually escalate their attacks on Turkish territories as the summer approaches. Turkish sources say the attackers infiltrated Turkey from their bases in northern Iraq, and the group launched an offensive on a Turkish military station. Turkish ground forces responded to the attack and drove out the attackers with the support of combat helicopters. The Kurdistan Workers' Party carried out a similar operation last summer and killed 12 Turkish soldiers. It is worth mentioning that thousands of people have been killed since these armed attacks began in 1984 by PKK members who demand secession. Turkey and other countries categorize the PKK as a terrorist group. Nabiha Watas, BBC.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights confirmed the killing of 14 people across Syria. The observatory spoke of intensified shelling that targeted the areas of al-Haladiyah, Jorat al-Shia, and al-Karabis in the city of Homs. Meanwhile, Damascus accused what it refers to as an armed terrorist group of hindering the evacuation of citizens who are besieged by the shelling in Homs. Members of the UN Security Council are meeting today to discuss the future of the International Observers mission in Syria and UN Arab League envoy Kofi Annan's plan. The head of the International Observers Delegation to Syria, General Robert Mood, is scheduled to brief the Security Council on the reasons for suspending the observers' mission.
We are very concerned about the suspension of mission observers in Syria, and we believe that all parties in Syria, should offer full cooperation to mission observers. It's very important for them to implement Kofi Annan's six-point peace plan. We believe the delegation is still carrying out its mission, even though we have received some conflicting reports about the current situation in Syria. General Robert Mood will submit a summary to the Security Council on what is happening in Syria.
Also on Syria, U.S. President Barack Obama said after a meeting with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin that the two countries agree on the necessity of finding a political solution in Syria to avoid civil war. For his part, Secretary General of the Arab League Nabil al-Arabi had high hopes for the Obama-Putin meeting, believing it was a chance for rapprochement and bridging the gap between Moscow and Washington on the Syrian crisis.
Kuwait embarked on a legislative shutdown after Kuwaiti Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed al-Sabah issued a decree suspending the National Assembly's sessions for 1 month. This is the first such constitutional decree in the history of Kuwait. Rising tension between the parliament and the government has led to the resignation of 2 cabinet ministers. The suspension comes on the eve of the planned questioning of the interior minister by opposition legislators. Ahmed al-Anazi reports from Kuwait.
This is the first time since the foundation of the Constitution that Article 106 is activated by the Emir of Kuwait, who called for the suspension of the National Assembly for 1 month. The decision was immediately approved by the Council of Ministers. The article states that an adjournment may not be repeated in the same session and may not be counted in computing the duration of Parliament.
The suspension will only affect parliamentary privileges with regard to the endorsement of laws. However, the work of parliamentary committees and legislators, or any type of work that doesn't require holding a parliamentary session, will not be affected by the suspension.
It was a surprise constitutional measure that the opposition described as a genuine right exercised by the Emir. The opposition said the decision will give the government an opportunity to reshuffle the cabinet after several of its members were questioned. The relationship between the government and the legislative authority has recently witnessed a major setback.
The committees will continue drafting laws, God willing, and in a month all these laws will be presented to Parliament.
Anti-corruption, financial disclosures, and constitutional codes are among the laws that were slated for discussion in the upcoming sessions. But in light of this latest decree, these laws are now facing uncertainty. Kuwait has entered parliamentary silence until further notice. This may either help restore the relationship between the executive authority or the government on the one side and the legislative authority represented by the parliament on the other, or it may lead to the dissolution of either one, according to knowledgeable sources on political affairs. Ahmed al-Anazi, Dubai TV, Kuwait.
ونعود إلى الأحداث المؤسفة في مخيم نهر البارد والتي كان
A tragic incident has rocked the Nahr al-Bared refugee camp. During a phone call with his Lebanese counterpart, the Palestinian president called for restraint and for an end to hostility in the camp, which held a funeral procession for a young martyr. A splinter group, which infiltrated the Lebanese army, was held responsible for another incident that claimed the life of another martyr. A Palestinian man was martyred and 13 others were wounded by the gunfire of the Lebanese army in the Nahr al-Bared camp during a funeral procession for Ahmed Qasim. The details are in the following report.
Ahmed Qasim is the martyr of the revolution and the Nahr al-Bared camp, as declared by the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the Fatah movement. The camps in the north of Lebanon have bid him farewell. The funeral procession was launched from al-Badawi refugee camp amid the participation of leaders of the various Palestinian factions and popular committees and delegations. The martyr was laid to rest to the beat of a show by the Guard of Honor of the National Security Forces. The mourners marched across Nahr al-Bared, where the young man was killed by Lebanese army gunfire amid the rage of residents. The streets were cut off with burning tires in different parts of the camp. However, a section remained open to allow the procession to pass. The coffin was taken to the sit-in tent.
We hope that the Lebanese government and the army will continue their investigation with transparency in order to preserve our rights and Ahmed's rights. Ahmed is our martyr and Nahr al-Bared's martyr. Credit goes out to President Mahmoud Abbas, who made it easy for me and my children to come here and see my son.
Qasim's home in the camp was packed with mourners, including political and factional leaders who came to offer their condolences. There was a demand to deal with Nahr al-Bared refugee camp like the remaining refugee camps in Lebanon.
We demand they deal with Nahr al-Bared as any other Palestinian refugee camp. Every camp has a written sign saying, "No entry by the army." This sign is written on the entrances of Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp and al-Rashidiyya camp. Why not Nahr al-Bared? They are deploying patrols inside the camp. They promised to look into it.
A prayer was performed for the martyr's soul in Al-Quds Mosque of the camp, while meetings are ongoing with the Lebanese side to settle the al-Bared issue.
When we met with the brothers in the army, we told them that they have the authority, but they must guarantee freedom, dignity and justice for the Palestinians in this camp. This is a martyr of the Palestinian Revolution, a martyr of Nahr al-Bared refugee camp, and martyr of all the refugee camps. He has fallen on the Lebanese soil, but we were hoping that he would fall by the border on the way to Palestine.
The funeral procession was turned into a popular march attended by thousands of the camp's residents. The martyr was laid to rest in the Khalid ibn al-Walid cemetery. Despite efforts to keep the march peaceful, a skirmish ensued between a number of mourners and the Lebanese army, killing a youth from the camp and injuring 13 others. This is a sad day for the loss of a youth and for the Palestinian-Lebanese relationship. But there's hope and an appeal for the future to be different from the past. From the heart-stricken refugee camp, Nahr al-Bared, northern Lebanon, Zaina Abed Samad, Palestine TV.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincoat Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic. Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.